It says recommendations made decades ago still haven't been implemented. The Scottish Government says it has taken action but recognises there's more work to do. Well, Sam Gluckstein is the head of the UK National Preventative Mechanism, which co-authored the report, and joins us now. Sam, thanks for coming on to the programme. As we said in the lead-in there, it is a pretty damning report.
It is a damning report, and good afternoon. Thanks for having me with you. I think what we see in this report is that the Scottish Government and the public sector here are very good at accepting the recommendations, and they're very good at making commitments to follow through. What we've tried to do with this report is cut through some of that noise and look over a period of 10 years and say, have outcomes for people who are having their rights potentially violated or in this control of the state, have outcomes improved for them. And what we've seen is, while we have had words, while we have had commitments, while we have had some improvements, although not many, we've not seen tangible outcome improvements for individuals detained and deprived of their liberty.
Yeah, and you've pointed out in the report that in some cases this has taken decades where, the government has committed to something that still hasn't happened.
It has, and what we see is time and time again recommendation essentially saying the same thing. And it's quite disheartening to see, because we have a really open human rights first government that really speaks all the words that we want to hear from our government as a human rights body, and yet we don't see the outcomes improving as much as we should. And we have numerous bodies, both domestic inspectorate bodies, scrutiny bodies, ourselves, and international bodies, United Nations committees, coming to Scotland, looking at what's going on at their request and telling the Scottish Government how they can do better. And to see outcomes not improving at the rate that we would like is deeply disheartening.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think the government's kind of talking a good game but not actually following through?
That's the question. I mean, that's sort of the unanswered question of this report. What we've tried to do is look over these last 10 years and in some ways slightly further and say, what hasn't changed? Where are these outcomes not improving? And the question why is one really for the government, because the government's committed to human rights. We see a human rights bill hopefully going through this parliament. We see the incorporation of the children's CRC. And yet we don't see outcomes improving. And what we really need is a focus from this government on improving these recommendations, on setting actions and really following through to outcomes to really improve things on the ground. Less talk, more action.
Yeah, what sort of things need urgent action then? Where would you start?
Well, what we've done in this report is we've looked at two of the most fundamental absolute rights. We've looked at the right to life and the prohibition on torture. So these aren't the nice to have rights. We're not talking about some that can be limited in certain circumstances. We're talking about the absolute essential rights. And we've gone through 29 recommendations that have failed to be implemented. So things like ensuring an independent, prompt and impartial review of all deaths in custody, looking at use of force, tackling overcrowding, mental health support in prisons. These are all things that tie into the absolute rights of individuals detained. So it's hard for me to say which one or two or three should we start with, because they're all essential and they're all things the government have committed to making improvements on.
And in the meantime, I suppose the question is, how many lives could have been saved?
Well, it's true that the independent review of deaths in custody can be seen as it needs to have learning from it. We need to be able to learn from deaths and to prevent these happening in the future. And absolutely, a focus on that has been outstanding for some time. The Scottish Government asked the Chief Inspector of Prisons, amongst others, to carry out a review of deaths in custody nearly two and a half, 3 years ago now. And we cover in this report and in other reports that many of these recommendations are still outstanding, including the key recommendation to introduce an independent investigation of all deaths in custody.
Yeah, and now we do know that the government is looking at emergency measures to try to ease the overcrowding situation. But again, there have been warnings about overcrowding for quite some time.
Absolutely. And we welcome some of these emergency measures to release the pressure, but they're doing it in a time of crisis. And, our report shows that as far back as 2013, the United Nations Committee Against Torture was expressing concerns about the growing population. And the Inspectorate of Prisons in Scotland and the Human Rights Commission and the NPM have been saying that the population crisis is reaching a balloon for a very long time. And yes, they are now taking action in a crisis period. But what we need to see is sustained change to affect this.
Sam, thank you very much indeed for coming on to Lunchtime Live. That's Sam Gluckstein there from the UK National Preventive Mechanism.